adventure in Finland on W4CY Radio.
This is the Pipe Man here on the Adventures Pipe Man W4CY Radio, and I'm pretty excited about our next interview here because we're going to talk about a great new album coming out that's a compilation album, and one of the best bassists out there. I don't think anybody else could pull off Pulling Teeth, and this guest right here, David Ellefson, how's it going?
Hey, it's going well, man. Thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, like I think it takes a lot of balls to try to pull off Cliff Burton, and you did it masterfully.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it was not something to go into lightly. You know, it's like playing Jaco Pastorius Birdland or Eddie Van Halen Eruption. You know, there's just some
Right.
things that are like, you don't just cavalierly like walk into it. Sure, I'll do that, but to whom much is given, much is expected, right? So I honestly, when Silver Linings Records came to me about it, I was kind of like, "Are you sure? I mean, really?" It's like, can't you ask Geezer or Steve Harris or It's like, and I was just like going, because I just like, look, me and Cliff. Look, Cliff joined Metallica in what, December '82. We started Megadeth June '83. So, I was 6 months behind him. Obviously, Metallica was already a force to be reckoned with, and we were starting Megadeth from the ground up. But, Cliff and I were friends, and we play very different, so I was just kind of asking, and they said, no, like, you're the guy, like you are the guy we want to do it. So it wasn't like there was a list, like if I was like, oh, I'm too busy. It was like there was a list. Like they were very focused on who they wanted to do the songs, and they wanted me to do this one. So I thought, okay, this is one where you step up. And I sat here in this very room, with my Jackson basses, plugging in, just going, all right, like how do I get into this song, right? Because it's a unique creation, right? It's not only it's a very expressive piece. And as I watched a bunch of video clips, there's the nucleus of the composition, but Cliff would take some liberties and go off and ad lib a little bit. And some days, if it was a big festival like that day on the Green thing, he was pretty aggressive and getting pretty wide with it, as we would, in front of that kind of a crowd. But for the most part, it's a composed piece. So I hit up my friend James Chen over at Aria Pro, who I had met at NAMM a few years ago. And Ray Burton was there, Cliff's dad, and they were rolling out the new Aria Pro Cliff Burton signature model, which is a beautiful, very nice instrument. Aria Pro makes some really good quality stuff, and it was neck through. It had a lighter gauge Roto Sound round wound strings on it. They also distribute the Morley Cliff Burton signature wah-wah, the distortion wah-wah pedal, which is a big signature of Cliff's, and for sure is the driver of this whole piece, this Anesthesia Pulling Teeth piece, right?
Right.
So once they kindly sent me all that stuff, because I told them what it was for, and they were super excited. They sent me the whole package. I opened it up, I plugged it in here, and as soon as I hit it, I heard the distortion, and I was like, all right, this isn't going to be so hard after all, because it isn't. This one wasn't just learning the notes. This was getting inside the song and really, becoming part of it, which I think you really have to do in any song. If I'm going to play an Iron Maiden song, it's like, okay, let me think like Steve. Let me think like a writer, a bass
Right.
player, a performer. You kind of visualize who he is, or Geezer, in any of your heroes, Gene Simmons, you know what I mean? Put yourself on 7-inch platforms, you're ready to breathe fire. That's how you play the slide in Cold Gin. Wow, you know what I mean? It's like, you're ruling the earth as the god of thunder, you know. So,
Right.
you have to get into the character of the person because the song is just an extension of the character.
Yeah.
So this song is just an extension of Cliff Burton's character. And to some degree, you kind of got to dress the part, look the part, play the part, in order to really execute it properly, I think.
Well, what I loved about it too is you definitely did justice, but you also gave a little bit of your spin on it. And I think that's important. You can't just I think anybody that tries to play it exactly like the original person, you're never
Mhm.
gonna like match that because you're not that person. So it's cool that you delved in and you got the spirit of Cliff, but then you
Mhm.
added the David to it to make it unique.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. And I agree. I watched some YouTube clips, and there's some of these, very educated musicians who could really break it down. They had manuscript on YouTube, so you could watch, the little bouncy ball on the notes, and I'm like thinking, man, these guys, these are very educated, studied players, who can do this kind of stuff. And I've been more of an artist and a performer as a bass player. I'm not so much of a professor in that respect. So I watched those guys and I went, oh, I'm doomed. You know what I mean? Because there's guys that don't look the part, but they can sit there with their bass up by their chin and play the part pretty much perfectly. And I'm like, sounds pretty good, but I had the advantage. I was in Europe last year, 2024, and I went down to see Metallica in Munich, and I got some time with Lars after the show, and I told him about this. I said, "Look, when I go home here next week, I'm going to be going into this session and recording this." And he even said, "He goes, yeah, that's kind of weird. Like, you're a pick player and Cliff's a finger guy, and you guys play very differently." I said, "I know. I tried to tell him this, you know what I mean? And they won't take no for an answer. And thank God they didn't. But so he gave it his blessing, and he's just like, well, he goes, you know what, make it your own. And Lars, he is the masterful composer. You know what I mean? And I thought, look, he was in a band with Cliff. He knew Cliff as a person, a bandmate, a bus mate, a backstage drinking beer, eating off the deli tray. Man, he really knew Cliff, and so to get his blessing, and wasn't this his blessing, but it was also sort of a creative. He's the maestro of in a sense, of Metallica, and so it's like, okay, um, what maestro? Any suggestions to me? What do you think? How would you approach this? And so it helped to get not only his blessing on it, but sort of give a little creative direction, even if it was just make it your own, which as you just brought up, kept me from having to be so tied perfectly to it that
Right.
I better get every bend and every note, or some guy in Ohio or some guy over in Turkey is going to be up my ass about how I messed it up. And so one of the things I did is, there's some other riffs of Cliff that I think are very definitive. For me, of course, it's P cells. That's my riff, right? That's my star that was blessed upon me in the musician. Geezer's guide. Ba da 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 NIB.
Right.
Bunch of stuff, right? So Steve Harris has got Wrathchild, Killer. So we all kind of have our identified signature riffs, right? And so I thought about Cliff's signature riffs, and of course, there's several inside of this piece of music with Anesthesia, but I also thought, look, For Whom the Bell Tolls, that's his piece cells, right? That's kind of our, when you hear Whom the Bell Tolls, that's really his riff, right? The other one
Mhm.
is that I really like is Orion, that doo, doo, doo,
Oh yeah.
doo, doo, doo. I love that. And Master of Puppets is really one of my favorite metal records and one of my favorite Metallica records, right? So and I got to talk with Cliff a bit, and they're on tour with Ozzy. Me and Dave went to go see them. Michael Alago, who had signed them to Elektra Records, we were in town. Michael was courting me and Dave to sign Megadeth to Elektra Records, and it didn't go that way. But we went over to see Metallica. They were, it's a big tour, them supporting Ozzy on the Master of Puppets tour, and I got to chat with Cliff a little bit about some of his composing. On Master of Puppets, and then of course, sadly, it wasn't but a few weeks or a couple months later
Mm.
he was gone. So, um, to just, I mean, Cliff and I never sat down with basses in hand and sort of broed down or anything like that. But just chatting as fellow musicians, fellow bass players, etc., seeing him perform a bunch. Again, it was about just sort of who is the entity. And that's why I said, in the little video that I shot when I did the playthrough, I said, this is my homage. This is my homage to Cliff. So to me, I kind of tried to make it even a little bigger than just Anesthesia pulling teeth. I tried to make it really more of a salute, um, to him as an artist, and try to include a bunch of his music inside of that performance.
I love it. And, based on everything you're saying, I I would have had a question before that I don't have now, and that is why Silver Lining Music picked you, and you were the one. You were the only one. I think everything you said is the reason they did. They wanted somebody, I think, a little different, but that is going to take it seriously. They didn't want
Mhm.
somebody just getting up there and copycatting. That's what I got out of the whole conversation. Is like David will put his own spin on it, make it unique, but he'll also study Cliff to make
Mhm.
sure there is homage paid to him.
Well, cool. Yeah, no, I guess so. I guess that is the reason. I mean, the people at Silver Linings are wonderful. They've got tremendous artists on their label, with Saxon and Uriah Heep, and bands I love. I love the bands that are on this record. I mean, as soon as they said Saxon and Testament and On the Almighty, I'm like, done. Say no more. What song do you want me to do? And then it was like
Right?
Anesthesia. I'm like, of course it would have to be that one, um, but no, you're right. I think this is. They did a great job with it, and it is funny that there's history around this whole No Life Till Leather thing. Of course, me being in Megadeth with Mustaine, which was the recorded demo that he was on.
Yeah.
Then
Which I
these,
have
which
still
is
to this
it's
day.
great. I love it. I love it, and I love Ron McGovney. I mean, really, I got to know Ron McGovney as a person. We used to go down to Orange County and go drink beer with him and his girlfriend, and have parties down in Orange County with Dave and his buddies. So I got to know him personally and have remained, friends with him. But more than that, as a bass player, I got to know his bass lines throughout those songs. And I remember when, excuse me, when Kill 'Em All showed up at the apartment there where me and Dave were living, and we sat and studied. And of course, Dave was studying more Kirk Hammett's guitar solos and maybe the songwriting. But I was paying attention to Cliff, and I went, I would have probably done that too. To slow the mechanics, which is renamed Four Horsemen, to slow it down and then be able to play that ba da 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 ba da 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 da, to play that bass riff along with it. Ron McGovney didn't do that. He played more kind of like Ian Hill. He played a straighter,
Mm.
riding the E string. Of course, the tempo was much faster on the No Life to Leather demo. So I A-B'd the two, right? And to me, I was listening. Okay, what did Ron do? What did Cliff do? And just as a bass player, as a fan, now learning this new genre of music that Dave is a part of, and it's going to be, sort of the bedrock upon which we're going to start our new band Megadeth and build, our empire upon that. I was, I wanted to take the time to study that, because you got to realize the 80s, especially that era, was a lot of left hand fingerboard acrobatics. Of course, Billy Sheehan was just not even human, the stuff he was doing, right? So, I spent a lot of time in Minnesota growing up studying these guys, all this stuff. LD Miola as a guitar player, his guitar playing came into my bass work, that really fast staccato left hand or right hand, plectrum work that he does. Obviously, Jocko was to the bass world what Eddie Van Halen was to guitars.
Nice.
I mean, really, he was more of a Jimi Hendrix, I guess. Just turning the bass, this sort of conservative, stand in the back, be this guy. Jocko's up front. Like, I guess maybe we're like Hendrix lighting his bass on fire and just being a maniac. And even though it was jazz and I was a rocker and a metalhead, I borrowed from everybody, you know. So as I was hearing that Cliff had spent some time in college or something, or had taken a course on some classical music, you know, I listened to it, and even those arpeggio riffs, that do 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 do, you know, those are kind of some. It's kind of the entryway into some of that type of playing. So when I
Yeah.
heard Cliff doing it, I'm like, all right, so we're about the same age. He was a little older than me, I guess, 4 years older than me. But again, we'd all kind of come into, you know, music, you know, through some of these same records, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, so I always look for the little details that set somebody apart and give them their unique character and their unique voice.
I think that's a big thing of the metal of the 80s, to be honest. I was talking about that recently. Like, take a lot of these new metal bands, they kind of use this, like, I call it an algebraic equation because they use this like formula, and nobody
Hmm.
had a formula back then, you know, and that's why you take the big four, none of you guys sounded the same. You know, it
Hmm.
wasn't like, oh, they're four of the same type of band because they're in the same genre. Really, it was like four totally different bands in a closeness of the genre, you know?
I would agree, and you know, I think with Megadeth having Garth Samuelson and Chris Poland for our first recording lineup really, you know, raised the bar, because again, I understood what Gar and Chris were doing with jazz music because I had studied. I'd played in jazz band in high school. I had a trombone player, buddy of mine, from jazz band and orchestra band, who was really into Spiral Gyra and you know, Weather Report. We went to go see Weather Report. It was right after Jocko and Peter Erskine had left the band. It was Omar Hakim and Victor Bailey, God rest his soul, who I got to meet years later at Berkeley College through my friend Steve Bailey. So even when I go to Berkeley College, when I've been hired in there for things, I can speak their language. I understand their language. You know, even Nick Menza's dad, Dodd Menza, you know, is just a badass icon, not just as a woodwind player, but as a writer and arranger. He wrote one of Buddy Rich's biggest hits. He was an arranger for Buddy, for Louis Bellson, you know, so he worked with you know, the fathers of the band Toto. He worked with them in their
Wow.
generation, you know, writing, and you know, we're talking about trying to do a documentary on him because I think you know, that's a whole other world of where that, you know, where all this stuff goes to, right? So, you know, different genre, but you know, even inside, you know, even inside the big four, let's call it, right? Which, you know, let's call it the early thrash scene, because really
Yeah.
Exodus was just as much a part of this. They were really the drivers of this whole thing by the time, you know, now knowing the history and, you know, friends with Gary Holt, you know, and of course, Kirk Hammett comes from Exodus, you know what I mean? So, but Exodus was really, they were kind of the pillar, you know, of the Bay
Totally.
Area scene, right? And even though their band didn't reach the commercial success, and they're doing great and doing better than ever now, you know, you know, Kerry King looked to them, we looked to them, obviously Metallica looked to them because they grabbed their guitar player, you know what I mean? So
Right.
they were this band of our genre, you know, and even looking behind you, you got your No Life Till Leather album cover up there for this album that we're talking about. You know, even that, there was kind of two Metallicas. Well, really, there's probably three. There's kind of the original one. Then there's the version when Dave was there for, I don't know. I call it a year and a half in the life of Metallica, right? When Dave was there, and then you know everything after. You know, when they
Yeah.
moved on as the recorded version, um, that they are. So, you know, and Megadeth had the same thing. You know, we had that early version with Kerry King and Lee Roush where we debuted the band. Um, and even before that, it was my friend Greg Handovit, Dijon Carruthers. You know, Greg Handovit was very much a voice and founding member of Megadeth. I mean, I've had him on my podcast, and you know, he really lays out the reality of, you know, how things really went down, and him naming the band and all this kind of stuff. So, but by the time, you know, 84 comes around, we finally record our first album, Killing Is My Business. You know, by that point, we've already been through, that was really kind of our third lineup.
Right.
But the one that gets recorded, that becomes, even by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's definition, that becomes the downbeat of the group, as a recorded lineup. So,
Yeah,
that is, I think that's kind of where, you drop the gauntlet.
totally. And to your point about Exodus too, I went to one of those actually probably the first, but one of those first Metallica shows, and I met Dave because like they played, I can't remember if it was the Troubadour, the Country Club, or whatever, and he comes off the stage afterwards, starts talking to me, and hands me his business card. I wish I still had it today. People, you still have that? No, I was a teenager. I like, what the fuck do I need this business card for? But it said Metallica, power metal, Dave Mustaine. So it's like they were power metal for a minute because there was no thrash except for Exodus. Like Exodus was considered the thrash, and it's kind of funny how it all went. And then, once Metallica and Slayer left LA and went to the Bay Area, and I cursed them out because then I had to hitchhike up to the Bay Area for real shows. But it was a different story because, like, I saw Slayer Striper open for Slayer as an example because they had nobody to play with. Nobody had anybody to play with. But that's what's cool about this album and what Silver Lining Music did, because there's a lot of these like compilation Metallica albums, but I think this one hits spot on because you're bringing people from that scene then. Like, I was at the show where Metallica first opened for Saxon in LA, and I was talking to John Gallagher yesterday, and I was like, that was the first time I saw you guys live because I saw you with Metallica at the Country Club, way back when. And so to me, this compilation represents Kill 'Em All for sure.
I completely agree. I think they did a great job pulling the right people in, and the Almighty, who really were the newbies, if you will, right? Because I remember, we would always take them on tour. We had the same agency, and he also books Metallica and Iron Maiden and stuff. So, but Ricky Warwick, who then went on to sing with Black Star Riders and essentially filled the shoes of Phil Lynott, for Thin Lizzy and all that kind of stuff. I mean, look, truly an artist on his own. The Almighty were one of these iconic. They were like a Motorhead. They weren't a thrash band. They were a little more than a rock and roll band, but they were somewhere in between, kind of like a Motorhead, and of the 90s, right? They really kind of anchored the 90s. So no, I totally agree. And I love the denim vest, the patches. I mean, you just look at it and it's like you're at Vakken or something, it's like, it says everything it needs to say about it. So no, I was really proud to be a part of this. And like I said, my role was to not only be part of this offering, but to again shine the spotlight on Cliff. And it is interesting that it's called No Life Til Leather. It's a tribute to Kill 'Em All, because again, that was exactly the era, those few months. Dave's out of Metallica, we start Megadeth, and then Kill 'Em All comes out. So I mean, this is my exact era right here, where I got introduced to all these guys.
That's why you should be on the album.
Exactly. It made sense. And this is why, record companies, they often know what they're doing.
Right.
So, this is one of those, just say yes, and learn the part and go. So
I'm glad you did, because you definitely paid homage to Cliff, and it was brilliant. Your version is brilliant, and I love it. And thanks for creating all this great music for all these years, and thanks for being on the Adventures of Pipe Man.
You're welcome, man. Good to chat. See ya.
Thank you for listening to the Adventures of Pipe Man on W4CY Radio.